Betrayed by her stepsister who stole her millionaire fiancé, she vanished without a word. Heartbroken, humiliated, and determined never to look back. Years later, she returned home for their mother's funeral, stronger, calmer, and married to a man no one saw coming. Her sister, still flaunting the life she had stole, froze when she's introduced to the new husband, one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. Her smile fades fast with jealousy and regret. What happens when revenge isn't loud, but breathtakingly elegant? Stay tuned and watch the story unfolds. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, the air inside heavy with lilies and quiet grief. Claire Bennett stood near the front pew, her black dress simple, elegant, and pressed without a single wrinkle. She had barely slept, yet her face showed no trace of fatigue, just the poised restraint of a woman who had trained herself not to break, not even now. Around her, mourners trickled in, relatives she hadn't seen in years, old neighbors, family friends with watery smiles and clasped hands. The solemn drone of the organ set the tone, mournful, reverent, and suspended in the weight of final goodbyes. Claire turned slightly to glance at the large photograph of her mother beside the closed casket. Margaret Bennett, in her favorite floral blouse, smiling as if nothing in life had ever gone wrong. Claire's throat tightened. The image felt cruel in its warmth. She remembered taking that photo on a spring morning in the garden, just before everything changed. Her fingers tightened around the small clutch in her hand. But that ache, the deep, echoing sorrow, was not what had Claire so rigid with unease. No, that would come walking through the chapel doors at any moment. Elise, her sister, her betrayer. Years had passed, but Claire could still feel the exact moment her world had cracked open. And now, the one person she never wanted to see again would be walking into this sacred space, into their mother's final memory, with her arm no doubt wrapped around the man Claire once planned to marry. The whispers began before she saw them. A rustle of silk, a shift in posture from the rows behind her, the unmistakable buzz of curious eyes tracking something, or someone. Claire didn't turn around right away. Instead, she let herself feel the moment, the heat crawling up her spine, the breath she couldn't quite steady. And then she looked. There they were. Elise floated in, dressed head to toe in designer mourning. Sleek black dress, flawless makeup, every detail curated for effect. Her arm was looped intimately through Daniel Wallace's, just as Claire predicted. He looked older, a little gaunter, but still carried himself like he owned every room he entered. Elise wore her triumph like a crown. Her left hand rested delicately against Daniel's chest as they moved down the aisle, her diamond ring catching the chapel light with calculated brilliance. She scanned the room, her expression practiced, part grief, part subtle superiority, until her eyes met Claire's. Something flickered. Claire didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply tilted her chin up and held the stare, letting the moment stretch like a drawn bowstring. No tears, no bitterness, only calm. Because this time, Claire had come prepared. She had mourned this betrayal long before her mother died. She had buried the girl who sobbed on the bathroom floor, who begged for answers, who left Boston with nothing but shame and silence. That Claire was gone. The woman standing in her place had something Elise could never steal. And Elise didn't even know it yet. Daniel gave Claire a stiff nod, the kind people offer acquaintances at funerals. Claire returned it coolly, then let her eyes drift back to Elise. Their gazes locked again. This time, Elise's confidence faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crept into her smirk. Good, Claire thought. Let her feel it. Behind her, soft voices murmured, and the organist began a new hymn. The service was minutes from starting. Claire turned back to the front of the chapel, steady and unmoved. Her father stood quietly at her side, his expression unreadable. She reached for his hand and gave it a light squeeze. He squeezed back. The grief was real. The loss of her mother, a wound still bleeding. But layered beneath that grief was something else, something tighter, sharper, and brimming with resolve. She didn't need to make a scene. She didn't need to speak a word, because Elise was about to find out the truth in the most poetic way possible. 5 years earlier, Claire Bennett's world looked like something lifted straight from a magazine cover. Her calendar overflowed with meetings and strategy calls. She was leading a fast-growing team at one of Boston's most respected marketing firms. Her corner office had a skyline view. Her wardrobe was tailored perfection, and her life, by every appearance, was on a steady climb. But nothing shined brighter in her life than Daniel Wallace. They had met at a charity gala in Beacon Hill, a black-tie event where the wine flowed endlessly and the room buzzed with promise. Claire had been coaxed into going by a colleague, tired from a full week but too polite to decline. Daniel, already a known name in tech circles, had been the keynote speaker. His charisma was magnetic, but it was the way he spoke to her, directly, intently, like she was the only person in the room, that stayed with her. From that first conversation, things moved quickly. Weekend getaways to Nantucket, candlelit dinners at impossible-to-book restaurants, surprise bouquets delivered to her office just because. He was attentive, generous, and ambitious. A self-made millionaire by 35, Daniel had built his fortune from a startup that skyrocketed, earning him both wealth and admiration in equal measure. Then came the proposal. It was a cool spring evening on Boston Harbor, just the two of them aboard a private yacht. A string quartet played softly in the background, the city lights shimmering across the water. Claire stood at the bow, admiring the skyline, when Daniel knelt behind her with a velvet box in his hand. A 5-carat marquise-cut diamond sparkled in the moonlight. Claire didn't hesitate. Through tears and laughter, she said yes. Everything that followed felt like a dream. Wedding planners were interviewed, venues booked, champagne tasting scheduled. Margaret, her mother, was delighted, practically floating through every conversation. It was exactly the kind of fairy tale she'd hoped her daughter would have. And then there was Elise. Claire's younger sister had always been magnetic in her own right, graced with the kind of beauty and charm that drew people in. Where Claire was composed and measured, Elise was spontaneous and disarming. Growing up, the competition between them had been quiet but constant. Elise had a way of turning everything into a challenge: grades, friendships, even birthday presents. Still, Claire wanted to believe things had changed. She chose Elise as her maid of honor, telling herself this was an opportunity to rebuild their bond. Margaret had been thrilled by the decision, whispering that perhaps this would bring her daughters closer. Elise accepted with a gleam in her eye and an overeager hug. "Anything for you, sis," she'd said, flashing her signature grin. At first, it seemed harmless. Elise attending fittings, helping choose flowers, even offering to handle the music list. But Claire began noticing little things. The way Elise laughed too hard at Daniel's jokes. The extra seconds her hand lingered on his arm. The late-night texts she claimed were about wedding logistics. Claire brushed the feelings aside. She was overreacting, tired, maybe a little sensitive. Daniel loved her. Elise was just being Elise. She had always been a flirt. It didn't mean anything. The engagement party was held in the Bennetts' sprawling backyard, strung with fairy lights and filled with friends and family. That night, Claire caught Elise watching Daniel from across the room. Eyes sharp, lips curled into something that looked far too pleased. When their gazes met, Elise raised her glass and offered a lazy smile. Claire told herself to let it go, but the unease followed her. It showed up in small, creeping ways. A strange perfume on Daniel's shirt, his sudden excuses to stay late at work, Elise volunteering to accompany him to vendor appointments that Claire couldn't attend. There were too many coincidences, too many moments that didn't quite add up. Her mother, ever intuitive, once pulled her aside in the kitchen. "I've seen the way Elise looks at Daniel," Margaret had said gently, stacking leftover appetizers into containers. "Just be careful, darling." Claire had smiled weakly, washing flutes in the sink. "We're adults now, Mom. She's happy for me." She wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that, because the alternative was unthinkable. But that illusion shattered just 3 weeks later. Claire's heels clicked quietly against the marble floor as she stepped off the elevator and walked toward Daniel's office. The lunch bag in her hand held his favorite, roasted turkey on rye from the deli across the street. She hadn't planned to drop by today, but after the week they'd had, distance, tension, cold shoulders, she needed to feel close to him again. She didn't knock. The door creaked open under her hand, and what she saw stopped her breath mid-inhale. Daniel's arms were around Elise. Her sister's body pressed against his, fingers tangled in the collar of his shirt. Their mouths were locked in a kiss, so familiar, so intimate, it was clear this wasn't a first. Elise's skirt was slightly hitched, her hair perfectly tousled like it had been arranged for this exact scene. For a long moment, they didn't notice her. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, her heart thudding so loudly she could feel it in her ears. The sandwich bag dropped from her hand, thudding softly against the plush carpet. That was when they turned. Elise didn't flinch. She stepped back slowly, smoothing her skirt like nothing had happened. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, already shifting into performance mode. "Claire," he started, voice low, like she'd caught him in some harmless mistake. "This isn't what it looks like." Claire's voice was hoarse. "How long?" Daniel glanced at Elise. She didn't speak, didn't even try to hide. Claire's eyes didn't move from his. "How long, Daniel?" He sighed. "A few months. It wasn't planned. I was going to tell you." Elise still said nothing. Claire stared at the woman she'd shared a childhood with. The girl who once begged to borrow her clothes, who cried when they moved into separate college dorms, who had stood beside her just weeks ago promising to help make her wedding day perfect. And now she stood here, silent, unapologetic, letting Daniel do all the talking. Claire turned and walked out. Not another word. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not there. She made it to the elevator, pressed the button, waited numb. Her phone buzzed later that night with a message from Daniel. "We should talk. Don't make a decision you'll regret." She deleted it. The next day, she returned the engagement ring to his doorman in a sealed envelope. No note. No croce. The fallout came fast. The wedding was called off. Vendors were notified. Deposits lost. Margaret tried to hold her together, while Claire's father paced the living room like he was ready to drive over and confront Daniel himself. "I trusted them," Claire whispered one night, curled on the living room couch under a wool blanket, her voice so small it barely reached her mother's ears. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret said, brushing her hair from her face. "You loved him, and you wanted to believe Elise had changed." The days blurred. Sleep was hard, food was harder. Every corner of Boston seemed to carry a memory. Every coffee shop, every street, every little place she and Daniel had shared. So she left. She packed what she needed and boarded a one-way flight to Chicago. Margaret helped fold the last sweater into her suitcase. Her father insisted on paying for the movers. They didn't ask her to stay. In Chicago, Claire found a modest studio apartment downtown. The city felt colder, harder. That suited her fine. She quit her job and took a position at a smaller agency. Less demanding, less visible. She started therapy, something she'd never considered before. For weeks, she barely spoke in sessions. But she went. The therapist's office became her anchor, a place to unravel the pain in manageable threads. The shame, the anger, the guilt. Especially the guilt. For not seeing it coming. For trusting Elise. For loving Daniel. She journaled. She took long walks by the lake. She cried when no one was looking. Slowly, the raw wound began to scab over. She stopped checking Elise's social media. Stopped replaying the betrayal like a scene she could edit. She started reclaiming parts of herself that had nothing to do with either of them. She was still broken, but no longer shattered. Then one morning, while balancing a coffee and her laptop at a local cafe, she heard someone ask if the seat beside her was taken. She looked up and met the eyes of someone who would change everything. Claire barely glanced up from her screen, lifting her hand toward the empty chair with a nod. It wasn't until he settled across from her, setting down his cappuccino and a well-worn paperback, that she looked up and saw him. Henry Callahan. She didn't know the name then, not in the way the world of finance and tech knew it. To her, he was just a tall man in a soft gray sweater, whose voice was calm and presence oddly grounding. He smiled, polite but not overly eager, and returned to his book. No small talk. No pretense. They shared that table for nearly an hour without more than a passing comment about the cafe's playlist. He left before her, offering a quick, "have a good day," and disappeared into the city. Claire thought little of it until she saw him again the following week. Same cafe, same quiet nod of recognition, another shared table, and again the next week. He introduced himself on the fourth encounter. "Henry," he said, offering his hand. "I figure it's time we graduated from silent strangers to slightly less awkward regulars." "Claire," she replied, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she smiled without forcing it. Their friendship grew with an effortless rhythm. No pressure, no grand gestures. He remembered her coffee order. She noticed he always tipped generously. They started having lunch at the cafe once a week. They talked about books, about city neighborhoods, about work, but never too deeply, not yet. Henry listened, really listened. Unlike Daniel, who had filled space with his own ambition, Henry left room for Claire's thoughts. He asked questions, not to impress her, but to understand her. He never once asked about her past, and she never offered it. It wasn't until months later, at a networking event her colleague dragged her to, that Claire discovered who Henry actually was. He'd been invited as a keynote panelist. The flyer introduced him as Henry Callahan, founder and principal of Callahan Ventures. An investor, they said, who had helped launch 3 unicorn startups. Billionaire, discreet, powerful, and elusive. Claire stared at the print, stunned. He'd never mentioned it. Not once. No dropped hints. No hamburgers. Not even a business card. She confronted him the next time they met. "You're Henry Callahan?" she said, sitting across from him with an accusing look. He laughed, sheepish. "I am. Technically. I just didn't want that to be the first thing you knew about me." Claire didn't know whether to be annoyed or impressed. In truth, it made sense. The way he dressed. The car she once glimpsed him driving. Understated, but far too sleek to be average. The quiet confidence that seemed born not of ego, but clarity. He had the kind of wealth Daniel had flaunted, except Henry wore his like a whisper, not a shout. And so, with cautious trust and a slowly mending heart, Claire let herself fall. There was no whirlwind, no fireworks, just steady, patient love. He cooked her meals. She shared her fears. They took walks by the river, read together in comfortable silence. He never pushed. When she hesitated, he stayed. A year passed, and with it came healing she hadn't thought possible. One evening, as snow dusted the windows of their favorite Italian restaurant, Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant ring. Not 5 carats, not yacht proposals, just one emerald, her birthstone, flanked by 2 delicate diamonds. "I don't want to change your world," he said, sliding the box across the table. "I just want to be in it." Claire's eyes filled with tears. She didn't need time to think. "Yes," she whispered, without a single doubt. It was a new kind of love, one that didn't need validation, one that didn't come with conditions or comparisons. Henry didn't rescue her. He simply stood beside her while she rescued herself. For the first time in years, Claire felt whole. And then the phone rang. Margaret's voice on the other end was quiet, tremulous. "Claire, sweetheart, I need to tell you something. I've seen the doctor. It's serious." Claire froze. Everything else fell away. The past had found her again. And then she got the call. Her mother was dying. The plane landed into Boston's South Airport just after sunset. Claire stepped off, Henry close behind her, the chill of late October biting through her coat. The city felt the same and different all at once. A familiar skyline casting shadows on a woman who no longer belonged to the life she'd left behind. The cab ride to her childhood home was quiet. Henry held her hand the entire way, saying nothing, just letting her lean into the silence. When they arrived, her father, James, opened the door before they knocked. His hair had grayed more than she remembered. His hug was long, wordless. In the living room, Margaret lay in a hospice bed they'd set up near the fireplace. The glow of a single lamp lit her face, paler now, with deep hollows beneath her eyes. But when she saw Claire, her lips lifted into the gentlest smile. "You came," Margaret whispered, her voice weak but warm. Claire sank beside her, taking her mother's frail hand in both of hers. Of course I came. The days that followed were a blur of whispered conversations, medications, and memories. Claire and Margaret talked deep into nights, sometimes about nothing, old neighbors, favorite recipes, stories from Claire's childhood. But sometimes, Margaret's voice would soften with purpose. "You and Elise," she murmured one night as Claire adjusted her blankets. "I've prayed every day that you'll find your way back to each other." Claire swallowed hard, the words sitting heavy in her chest. "Mom, I don't know if I can. I'm not asking you to forget what she did," Margaret said. "But don't carry this bitterness forever. It's too heavy, sweetheart." Claire didn't answer. She didn't have one. Henry stayed through it all, quietly helping her father with groceries, speaking gently to the hospice nurse, making tea Claire never asked for, but always drank. When Margaret grew too tired to speak, he would sit with Claire by the bed, one hand on her back, grounding her with nothing more than presence. And then, one morning, Margaret was gone. She passed in her sleep, her final breath a soft sigh as the sun rose across the curtains. Claire had been holding her hand. Her father sat across the room in silent grief, and Henry, standing quietly behind them, walked over and wrapped Claire in his arms without a word. The morning of the funeral arrived with gray skies and a soft drizzle. Claire stood in her childhood bedroom, adjusting her black dress in the mirror. Her hands trembled only slightly. Downstairs, voices were beginning to gather, neighbors, relatives, old friends. She stepped out, Henry waiting at the bottom of the stairs in a black tailored suit. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the room. "Ready?" he asked gently. "No," she replied, "but I'll go anyway." At the funeral home, people milled in slowly, filling rows with hushed greetings and soft condolences. Claire sat beside her father in the front pew, Henry at her other side, his hand resting lightly on her knee. Then she felt it, the shift, the rustle of dresses, the low murmurs, the subtle pull of attention toward the back of the chapel. They were here. Claire turned. Elise entered first, her arm looped through Daniel's. She looked flawless, styled, every detail perfected. Her dress, expensive. Her ring, impossible to miss. She wore mourning like it was another accessory, a well-staged performance. Claire met her eyes and held the stare. Elise smiled. Daniel, thinner now and more weathered, offered a short nod. Claire returned it with indifference. They began their slow walk down the aisle, greeting people as though they were royalty arriving at court. Elise's eyes scanned the front row, calculating, waiting for her reaction. Claire stayed still. Henry leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Is that them?" Claire didn't look at him. Her gaze was locked ahead. "Yes." He nodded, nothing more. As Elise approached, her stride faltered. Just for a second, her eyes landed on Henry, taking him in, the calm confidence in his posture, the sharp cut of his suit, the understated luxury of the watch on his wrist. Something flickered behind her gaze. Recognition? Confusion? Claire couldn't be sure. Elise opened her mouth, as if to speak. Claire stood. She reached for Henry's hand, fingers lacing with his. "Elise," she said simply, "this is my husband." And just like that, the smile on her sister's face cracked. Elise blinked. For a full second, she stood completely still, as if her brain refused to process the words she'd just heard. Claire's voice had been calm, deliberate, unshakable. "This is my husband." She'd said it again without fanfare, but the weight of those 4 words hit Elise like a slap across the face. Her eyes dropped to Claire's hand, entwined effortlessly with Henry's. Then up again, slowly, scanning his face. Henry offered the briefest nod of acknowledgement, polite but reserved. Elise's mouth parted as if she might say something clever or cutting, but nothing came out. Claire didn't move. But it wasn't Elise who reacted first. It was Daniel. His eyes darted from Henry to Claire, then back to Henry again. The color drained from his face in slow motion, like watching ink seep out of photograph. Recognition flashed, followed by disbelief. "Callahan," he muttered. Claire caught it. So did Henry. She felt Henry's posture shift slightly, a subtle tightening at the shoulders, though his expression didn't change. Daniel gave a tight, awkward chuckle, though there was no humor in it. Well, that's unexpected. Henry looked at him directly now. Daniel Wallace. Been a while. Claire turned toward Daniel then, catching the faint tremor in his jaw. Whatever rivalry they shared, whatever unfinished business lingered, it had just surfaced like a shark fin in calm water. Elise's brows furrowed. She looked between them, her confusion overtaking her usual poise. You two know each other? Henry didn't answer. Daniel did. We pitched to the same investor years ago, he said quickly. Same space. Same product class. Claire raised an eyebrow. That was a watered-down version of the story, she could tell. And, judging by the way Daniel refused to meet Henry's eyes again, she knew he was downplaying something significant. Elise said nothing. Her mouth pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Claire let the silence hang there, then gave the smallest smile, the kind Elise used to give when she knew she'd won, except now it was on Claire's face. I hope you enjoy the service, Claire said softly. Elise tried to recover. Of course. We wouldn't miss it. She moved past them with Daniel trailing closely behind, his hand briefly hovering at her lower back before she shrugged him off. They slipped into a pew near the middle. Claire didn't watch them settle. She simply turned back to the front and sat beside Henry again. Her heart was steady. Her hands didn't tremble, but she felt something strange, like years of bitterness had shifted, just slightly, as if a splinter had finally been pulled out. The service passed in a blur of hymns and eulogies. Friends and neighbors shared stories of Margaret's kindness. Claire gave a heartfelt tribute that left the room in quiet sobs. Henry stayed by her side the entire time, quietly supportive, a steady presence amid the waves of grief. It wasn't until later, after the casket was lowered, after the final condolences had been offered, after the last of the guests filtered away, that the next moment came. Claire and her father returned to the house first. The quiet inside felt like an exhale. Henry stepped out to take a call, leaving Claire alone in the kitchen, still wearing her heels, still holding a glass of untouched water. The doorbell rang. Claire froze. She knew. She moved to the door, already anticipating the face behind it. When she opened it, Elise stood alone on the porch. No Daniel. No smug expression. Just her sister, in a black dress, mascara smudged slightly under one eye, her shoulders curled inward like someone trying to make herself smaller. I wasn't sure if I should come, Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire didn't say anything. Can I come in? She nodded once and stepped aside. Elise walked into the house slowly, her eyes scanning the hallway like it had been years. Which in some ways it had. She sat at the edge of the couch, legs crossed tightly, hands clenched in her lap. I wanted to talk to you, she said. Claire leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms folded. She waited. Elise looked up, eyes glassy. You were always the strong one. You know that, right? Claire didn't reply. I'm not here to fight, Elise added quickly. I know what you think of me. I know what I did. Claire's chest tightened. She'd expected another passive-aggressive swipe, another veiled insult wrapped in sisterly guilt. But Elise didn't throw anything. Instead, her voice cracked, and then she broke down. I'm miserable, Elise said, her voice breaking. Daniel isn't who I thought he was. Or maybe he is, and I just didn't want to see it. Claire said nothing, but her jaw loosened slightly. Elise took a shaky breath. He's cold, controlling. The house, the vacations, the cars, it's all smoke and mirrors. His company's drowning in debt. We're living off loans and appearances. He checks my phone, tracks my spending. And I let him. Claire raised an eyebrow, not with surprise, but something closer to bitter understanding. I couldn't tell anyone, Elise continued, wiping at her face. I was too ashamed. I destroyed my relationship with you. I threw away everything good in my life for him. And now I'm trapped in a life I can't even pretend to want anymore. The room went silent. Claire stepped away from the wall and moved to the edge of the couch opposite her sister. She sat, posture stiff but composed. Why now? She asked, voice even. Why tell me this now? Elise looked up, eyes rimmed in pink. Because she's gone. Mom's gone, and I can't keep carrying this around anymore. She wanted us to fix things. I don't know if we can. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know the truth." Claire stared at her for a long moment. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't carry this bitterness forever. It's too heavy, sweetheart." "I'm not ready to forgive you," Claire said at last. "Not yet. I understand. But I hear you." The two sisters sat in the stillness of the living room, once filled with laughter and piano lessons and the scent of Sunday dinners. Now it was quieter, heavier, but for the first time in years, there wasn't venom between them. Just hurt, raw, exposed, and finally acknowledged. Months passed. Boston faded behind Claire like a chapter closed neatly at the spine. Back in Chicago, she dove back into work, comforted by routine and Henry's unshakable support. The grief over her mother lingered, soft and persistent, but healing began to stitch itself together. Then came the morning she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, pregnancy test in hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. Henry found her there, laughing and crying at the same time. He wrapped his arms around her without a word and whispered, "We're going to be okay." And they were. Her life, quiet, real, and whole, had bloomed out of the ashes of everything she once thought she needed. Elise reached out a few weeks later. She'd left Daniel, quietly, without drama. She found a modest apartment near Cambridge and picked up part-time marketing work at a boutique firm. Claire asked her once what finally pushed her to walk away. "I looked at myself one morning and didn't recognize who I was," Elise said. "And I thought, maybe it's not too late to change." They didn't become best friends overnight. Calls were infrequent, but honest, and there was no pretending anymore. Just the slow, careful rebuilding of something fragile but real. Claire didn't forget what Elise had done. She didn't excuse it, but the weight she'd carried for 6 years, the anger, the betrayal, the wound that refused to close, it no longer owned her. She had a husband who adored her, a child on the way, a life she built, not on revenge or resentment, but on clarity, healing, and quiet strength. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit on the porch of their brownstone, hand on her belly, and think about the road that brought her here. She never would have chosen that betrayal. But without it, she wouldn't have this. She wouldn't have him, or them, or herself. Forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't a gift she gave Elise. It was the freedom she gave herself. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.